Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies here at Harvard. Welcome to our first Dr. Class Tuesday webinar of the year. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we're going to continue to be remote at least through this fall semester. But that's enabled us to do some really interesting programming. So I'm excited about telling you about it in a second. First of all, I want to thank our wonderful team of Paola Ibarra, Jillian Scales, and Gabrielle Patterson for making this event possible. I also want to introduce my amazing co-host, Professor Francis Agopian.
Hi, welcome everyone.
If you're thinking to yourself, where's that other professor, the one who's really smart and asked all the great questions? Alicia Holland is on leave this year, unfortunately. So it'll just be Fran and I, but Alicia will be back eventually. We have a really, really great lineup this semester, including panels on Latin America's post-COVID economic recovery, the recent wave of protest and repression across much of Latin America, the changing politics of abortion in Latin America, the impact of Venezuelan migration, populism in the courts, the upcoming Chilean election, and a terrific all-star panel on the state of democracy in Latin America. You can find a schedule on the Dr. Class website, and it may be up in the chat, I don't know. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. First of all, this event does have Spanish language translation. Just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can get the language of your choice, as long as the language of your choice is English or Spanish. Second of all, we will be recording the webinar today. It'll be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel not long after today's session. We will also email a link of the recording to everyone who registered for the event. Third, if you have a question for the panel, we just don't want to hear it directly from you. Do not send it through the chat function. Send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll have at least 30 or 40 minutes at the end of the presentations today for Q&A. And Kai Thaler, who I will introduce in a second, will be fielding the questions and passing them on to our speakers. We've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, which should leave us with a good half an hour for Q&A. We should close around 1:20 or 1:25. All right, we have an extraordinary panel, actually an extraordinarily depressing panel today on Nicaragua's collapse into dictatorship. We have outstanding Gioconda Belli, Fernando Chamorro, Mateo Jarquin, and Emilia Yang. And to moderate the panel, we've invited Professor Kai Thaler, who's a former member of our always a member of our Dr. Class family. Kai is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He got his PhD here at Harvard in the government department, and he's done considerable research in and on Nicaragua and has published widely on the country's descent into authoritarianism in recent years. So we thought it really a good idea to invite him back to moderate this panel. So Kai, I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve and Fran, and also to Paula, Gabrielle, and Jillian for your work in organizing this event. Nicaragua this summer has experienced an unprecedented wave of political repression, with dozens of opposition politicians and civil society figures disappeared, imprisoned, and subjected to judicial persecution. This crackdown, ahead of scheduled elections in November, when President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo will face no real contenders, comes 3 years after the government crushed pro-democracy protests, killing hundreds, arresting and torturing many more, and sending hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans fleeing abroad. The current slide into authoritarianism began with Ortega's return to the presidency in 2007, but many would argue it has earlier roots in political decisions and actions during the revolutionary period and civil war of the 1980s, and after the establishment of full electoral democracy in the 1990s and early 2000s. To discuss the present political situation in Nicaragua and where the country might go from here, we have an amazing set of panelists. Gioconda Belli is a prize-winning author, novelist, and poet. She was active in the Sandinista revolutionary struggle in the 1970s, and then served in the government in the area of media and communications in the 1980s. She's been very active in the efforts of PEN International to promote free cultural expression in Nicaragua and beyond. Mateo Jarquin is assistant professor of history at Chapman University and received his PhD in history at Harvard. His forthcoming book explores the rise and fall of the Sandinista revolution in the context of the global Cold War. And his research more generally examines how revolutions in the so-called third world shaped global debates about democracy, development, and international relations. Emilia Yang is an artist, organizer, and scholar, and is completing her PhD in media arts and practice at the University of Southern California. Her artwork and engaged scholarship have been widely exhibited and published, and she's recently been working with the Asociación Madres de Abril on the award-winning project Ama y no Olvida, Memory Museum Against Impunity, a transmedia memory museum to commemorate and seek accountability for victims of state violence since April 2018. Carlos Fernando Chamorro is a leading independent investigative journalist and the founder of Confidencial, one of the most important remaining sources of independent reporting and information in Nicaragua. He also directs and hosts the Sunday night television program Esta Semana. During the first Sandinista regime and through 1994, he was editor-in-chief of the government newspaper Barricada. He's received multiple major international awards for his efforts to promote accountability and preserve freedom of the press in Nicaragua. Each panelist will present for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for a question and answer period for those of you attending. You can type your questions by clicking the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will compile and read questions as time permits. Y se puede escribir preguntas en español también. Thank you, everyone, and we will now begin with Gioconda Belli.
Thank you very much, and it's quite an honor to be here and be able to speak about Nicaragua and what's happening. So I will begin. I will unfortunately have to leave in half an hour, but I'll try to do my best in the time I have. During the 2006 electoral campaign, Daniel Ortega ran as an FSLN candidate for the third time. The opposition was divided. The popular candidate of the Reform Sandinista Party, who had a good showing in the polls, had died at the start of the campaign. I remember harboring the disquieting certitude that if Daniel Ortega became president, he would never risk losing power again. It was a certainty that came from observing how he had behaved after losing the 1990 elections. When he gave his concession speech to Violeta Chamorro, acknowledging her victory, on the early morning of February 26, I thought, because I usually hated his speeches, that he had for the first time spoken like a head of state. On the 27th, however, at a rally I attended in a small plaza, he delivered an impassioned harangue and a battle cry. He would rule from below. I believe that his defeat had finally dawned on him, and his uncensored reaction was that of an angry and vindictive tribal chief. From 1990 to 1993, the Sandinista Party held collective and private discussions to analyze the causes of the defeat. And the most important issue at stake, however, was to decide what role would Sandinismo play within the opposition. Ortega's line was that he would remain General Secretary and that all bets, including violence, were in play. Many of us advocated for a nonviolent, constructive role. Ortega used his authority, manipulations, and threats to silence the dissent. It became a tug of war that ended up in the split of Sandinismo. I think that deep down, Ortega was afraid that he was going to be displaced if he let all of us have our say. He ran for election and lost in 1996 and 2001. For the 2007 campaign, he abandoned all scruples. He negotiated with the church and with the corrupt former president Arnoldo Alemán. He declared himself a Christian. He transformed his persona. Dressed in white, he talked about love, peace, and jobs. He asked for forgiveness for his past mistakes. He promised to respect democracy and private property. He won with 38% of the votes. As a president, he acted quickly to demolish institutions and the separation of power. Eventually, he reformed the constitution to be able to be re-elected indefinitely. In 2016, he was so sure of his power, that he took his wife as vice president. I have only seen that happen in House of Cards. By then, the electoral machinery was in his hands. His wife, and as were all the powers of the state, the army, the police, and the judicial system. Ortega presided over a strong state with money from Venezuela and an alliance with the Nicaraguan capital and private companies. He felt invincible. The opposition could not get the population to react against the many measures that were consolidating Ortega's command and clearly establishing a dictatorship and concentrating power in his family. Repression was selective. Popular protests were few and far between. Only the peasants had managed to organize almost 100 marches to protest a concession Ortega had given to a Chinese entrepreneur of building an interoceanic canal through Nicaragua. In April of 2018, a fire at the Indio Maíz forest reserve and a social security reform that published a 5% tax over the pensions that retirees got, started a protest. A protest began, and surprisingly, the entire country that until then seemed to be a little quiet and not have a lot of desire to protest against this dictatorship that was consolidating itself, there was a social explosion of rebellion. And the systematic, I am going to need to have somebody else talk about the details of this, of what happened on April 2018, because I want to get to the main point I want to make here. I was just giving you a little bit of a framework. The systematic repression that Ortega put in place after the 2008, of course, has had a demobilizing effect. The dictatorship has used new methods that have never seen in Nicaragua before to prevent the opposition leadership from consolidating. In June this year, 5 months before the general elections of November, he imprisoned all aspiring presidential candidates along with civilian leaders, businessmen, journalists, and some iconic Sandinista figures. He also canceled the only independent political party that was in the running. And this has been the most radical sign that Ortega was going straight in the direction of a dictatorship that I think we cannot yet know exactly the nature of, except for the repression and the cruelty, etc. We don't know the exact nature of his intent at the end of all this build-up. But I wanted to refer then to the nature of the resistance against the regime. What I want to point out is a problem that I find is generalized in the modes of organization of the popular rebellions that we have witnessed, from the Arab Spring to the April 2018 rebellion in Nicaragua. I feel this issue requires analysis and study because it reveals new features that perhaps help to explain how it is that these mass demonstrations have more effect than efficiency. The April rebellion was without a doubt an impressive manifestation of the Nicaraguan population's rejection of the dictatorial features of the Ortega and Murillo regime. It was without a doubt a horizontal exercise. The participants called themselves autoconvocados. This is a translation that I don't know if it works, but self-summoned. They proudly expressed that they did not respond organically to anyone. Each city, each barricade was autonomous. When the government, in a dialogue that it convened on May 16, raised as a condition for the talks to advance that the roadblocks or tranques, like we call them, all over the main roads were dismantled, no one could offer such guarantees. Each barricade was autonomous. The April rebellion in Nicaragua had no one in command. When the government began its cleaning operation, no one could order unarmed people at the roadblocks to retreat and not resist a military force that was armed to the teeth and free to kill. I first became aware of claims for the horizontal way of organizing in 2002 when I attended the Second World Social Forum in Porto Alegre. Born as an initiative of the so-called anti-global movement under the slogan, "Another world is possible," the Porto Alegre Forum brought together activists of all kinds and genders and was organized to advance the articulation of a global solidarity movement that would democratize and humanize globalization. It was about creating voices and movements not to oppose globalization per se, but to force the hegemonic countries to listen to the voices of 70% of the planet's population, to whom the policies imposed by the centers and power impacted directly. The centers of power, I'm sorry. In Porto Alegre, in southern Brazil, 70,000 participants from 150 countries proclaimed a faith in change and a belligerency of the left that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the so-called real socialism seemed already extinct. The most striking element was that in response to the authoritarianism of the left, the organization vowed to act democratically and organize horizontally. The physiognomy of the participants, the diversity and mixtures of races was a living testimony of the global world. What I asked myself after hearing impassioned criticism of verticalism and hierarchies within the movements was how these happy revolutionaries conceived of a horizontal mode of organization in the face of the forces they plan to stand against? And how did they plan not to disperse in many fragments and become irrelevant? The need of a united front against the Contra war in Nicaragua stifled criticism during the 80s and turned most of us Sandinistas into a largely uncritical mass. The experience made me sympathize with the idea of horizontality. Well, I am at 10 minutes, I'm sorry. But what I wanted to say was that the experience that we have had in Nicaragua, what worries me is that the horizontal mode of organizing has, I wonder if it's going to be effective, because what the dispersion of the resistance, the dispersion of the response to what is happening now, besides the repression, has to deal with this kind of atomization of people who can respond and who can organize what's going on and make a united front. I'm sorry, I took a little longer. I thought I was going well on my time. Well, thank you.
No, you're totally fine. Thank you so much, Gioconda. We'll now turn it over to Mateo Jarquin.
Of course, thank you so much to Dr. Class, an institution which was my intellectual home for many years while I did my PhD. And thanks in particular to the Tuesday Seminar, which is a space that has long considered Nicaraguan politics worth analyzing. As far back as 2014, I recall at least one event per year on Nicaragua's democratic backsliding, long before Daniel Ortega was really grabbing headlines. Now, Nicaragua has descended into complete dictatorship with such speed and drama that it feels stunning. But I think that if one were to travel back to those old Tuesday seminar sessions, and if one listened to Gioconda's presentation just now, you'll get a sense that we actually have a very strong consensus, a strong story as to how we got here in recent years. With that said, it's one thing to know the story of what happened in Nicaragua over the past 2 decades. But I think that it's another to ask what it all means, what the rise of the Ortega dictatorship means in terms of fitting with other themes and narratives that we use to make sense of national and regional politics. For example, one question that I'm sure interests Francis Hagopian and Steve Levitsky is the question of what the rise of an old school dictatorship in Nicaragua tells us about the status of Latin America's third wave of democratization. How exceptional is the Ortega regime really? As Gioconda mentioned, what is its exact nature? Where does it land in the classic taxonomy of authoritarian regimes in the region? So maybe that's something that will come up in the Q&A. But the principal question I'd like to address, or raise rather, has to do with the history and legacy of the Sandinista revolution. And specifically, what I want to put on the table is the question of whether the Ortega Murillo regime meaningfully represents continuity with the Sandinista revolution of the 1980s, or if we should think of the Sandinista revolution as something that ended a long time ago. Given the pressing issues, the enormous risks and uncertainty that we're facing today, this line of inquiry may sound trivial, but this question is very much important to the regime. It holds a lot of implications for the political arena moving forward, and it is therefore not something that civil society can easily ignore or run away from. And so to see why, I'm going to show you just a couple of images. So You can see here Daniel Ortega, right, with his wife and Vice President Rosario Murillo, standing alongside Carlos Fonseca Terán, one of the children of Sandinista Front founder Carlos Fonseca Amador. The staging here is closely related to the official discourse, which in a nutshell argues that the Sandinista revolution never really ended, even after the FSLN was voted out of power in 1990. In their telling, Ortega and his wife embody the revolution, which is now in a second or perhaps third stage, depending on who you ask. They therefore portray any opposition to the government, including the 2018 protests that Gioconda mentioned, as a threat not only to the Ortega family itself, but to the memory and legacy of the Sandinista revolution. Were he to be toppled, they imply it would represent a victory for the same US intervention and counter-revolution that we saw in the 1980s. It would also mean an end to the alleged social gains produced by the revolutionary project, past and present. Now, this claim of revolutionary continuity is a little overblown, to say the least, when you consider that the Ortega era Sandinista front, again, as Gioconda very nicely described, completely abandoned any attempt to remake the class or social structure of Nicaraguan society. In fact, it adapted enthusiastically to the neoliberal context of the post-Cold War era and adopted traditional conservative social values in the process. So there's not much left of the left program of the 1980s, but it's still the same flag, many of the same songs, many of the same symbols. Ortega wants Nicaraguans to think that what is happening today has everything to do with 1979, the year that the Somoza dictatorship was overthrown and the Nicaraguan revolution began. And incidentally, many hardline anti-Sandinistas, for what it's worth, also think that Ortega's current authoritarianism is a natural consequence of the Sandinistas' rise to power in 1979, just not in a good way, of course. Then there's what I, for a lack of a better term, would call the sort of dissident, critical Sandinista narrative that is reflected most prominently in the memoirs of high-profile Sandinista intellectuals that broke with Ortega in the 1990s. And in this view, the Sandinista revolution ended in 1990, not only because of US intervention, but also because of the revolution's own mismanagement and authoritarianism. So this self-critical account rejects Ortega's heroic narrative, but it is heroic in its own way. As you can see in this key passage from Sergio Ramirez's memoir, who wrote that the revolution did not bring justice for the oppressed, nor did it bring wealth and development, but it left as its greatest achievement a democracy, which, as a paradox of history, is the revolution's most visible inheritance. And recently, even Daniel Ortega's own brother, Humberto, who was the chief of the military in the 1980s, actually echoed this perspective in a CNN interview, where he said, again, that the most important product of that revolutionary feat of 1979 was opening the road to democracy. So in this narrative, Ortega is typically portrayed as a traitor, as a usurper, first because he abandoned, again, the FSLN's redistributive economics and progressive social policies, but also, again, because he's seen as undermining the revolution's most important, if somewhat inadvertent, achievement. So in summary, this narrative, by contrast, wants you to think that Ortega's authoritarian pretensions don't have that much to do with 1979. Now, the difficulty with this narrative is that Ortega doesn't just have authoritarian pretensions anymore. He has consolidated an actual dictatorship that is extremely similar to what came before the revolution. So whatever democracy the revolution wound up producing in 1990 no longer really exists. The silver lining in that narrative is much more difficult to make out now. And moreover, the brutal repression in the past few years by security forces waving the red and black flag of Sandinismo has made it increasingly difficult to talk about Sandinismo outside of Daniel Ortega, which is, of course, exactly what he wants. He wants to be the embodiment of that idea, of that movement. And so the nature of the entire debate has actually changed in recent years. I've actually been interested to see how some proponents of this dissonant Sandinista thesis have actually started modulating their perspective in the past year or two. So including Sergio, including Dora Maria Tellez, who is now in jail, maybe even Gioconda, she might disagree. But a lot of these people have sort of started to play down their Sandinista heritage. They've sort of begun to depart from this narrative of the revolution's noble but flawed legacy. And they've even kind of adopted the darker view that all the revolution really gave us was Daniel Ortega, that maybe the revolution is something that they regret sometimes. Now, to begin wrapping up, this may seem like a very academic question, much like the old debates about the true Russian Revolution. Did it end when the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917? Or did it end with the rise of Stalin, with the fall of Stalin? Or perhaps the question of Daniel Ortega evokes most strongly the debates about the place of Napoleon Bonaparte in French history. Did he represent a rupture with or a continuity with the French Revolution? But these questions really matter for Nicaraguans. And you saw that Gioconda was talking a lot about the story of Daniel Ortega in this historical experience of the revolution. And it's important first for reasons of identity that are central to the country's politics moving forward. Ortega has a very coherent narrative. And with that comes a strong identity for his base, a strong sense of where they're coming from and where they're going. And the anti-Ortega universe, in my opinion, aside from the organizational issues that Gioconda identified, lacks a strong identity and brand. And I know that some of you will disagree. Moreover, a significant number of Nicaraguans still support Ortega and Murillo despite the increasing repression. And if we want to begin to understand that persistent government support, we have to understand the ways in which the regime has sustained itself using historical imagery and narratives. Second, this historical debate is naturally going to inform the solution to the crisis moving forward, especially when it comes to the institutional picture. Today's security forces, for example, descend directly from the revolution. The Nicaraguan army was literally born in 1979 to defend the revolution, and it grew up combating the US-backed Contra. It became less partisan in the 1990s, but did not fully break with this origin story. And so that example connects to a wider point, which is that institutionally, in terms of the key debates, the key cleavages, the key identity politics, we live in a world that was created not so much after 1990 when the democratic transition took place, but after 1979. And so in order to understand why the democratic experiment failed, how to build a democracy in the future, we need to understand the contradictory relationship between the Sandinista revolution and that democratic experiment. So in conclusion, I know that I raised more questions than answers, but I think that's the point. I'm interested in hearing what Carlos Fernando and Gioconda think about how their views on the legacies of the revolution have evolved. I want to hear what Emilia thinks as well, my contemporary, since we grew up in a different context. And yeah, to summarize, when do you think the revolution really ended? What is left of the original Sandinista project? And what is the memory of that revolution going to look like in the future? I look forward to your answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Mateo. And now we will move along to Emilia.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see it? Is it okay? Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm so thankful to be here. Thank you for the invitation and be able to share with you. Mateo, your questions are so interesting and I hope we address them in the Q&A, but I'm just gonna try to talk a little bit of what I have focused recently since 2018, which has been process of memorializations of victims of human rights through the creation of this project that is called Ama No Olvida Memory Museum Against Impunity. And I created this project in partnership with the victims of state violence to dispute the narrative, actually, that criminalizes the citizens that participated in the civic protests and the climate of impunity that the Nicaraguan government wants to install. I'll tell you a little bit of how we created the museum. And all this crossed me like personally, because my uncle Vicente Rapachelli was assassinated on June 26 while he was passing a paramilitary checkpoint in Nicaragua, and his case continues without investigation or due process. So I will describe how I've been moving from denouncing to mourning to fighting for the right to justice, truth, and memory, and articulating the process. And my thinking is grounded in the tension between accounting and typifying the violence, as well as documenting the practices of memory, resistance, and public mourning against authoritarianism performed by the families and of the victims. And it also emerges from the necessity to dig deeper and find so much strategies to disrupt and create in the midst of all this violence. I'll share, this is like really quickly some of the things Gioconda was talking about, how the cities uprose. Like there was a whole insurrection and all the major roads were blocked with the same barricades that were erected in 1979 during the popular uprising against Somoza. And at the same time as Mateo and Gioconda were talking about, the state created a paramilitary army to do a militarized operation called Operation Cleanup and kill whoever stood by the barricades. And this is how the state-sponsored paramilitary looked like. And they were popularly called death caravans, las caravanas de la muerte. And in December 2018, the interdisciplinary group of experts, of independent experts, HIE for Nicaragua, selected by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, described the actions of the Nicaraguan government as crimes against humanity, with a pattern of conduct that included extreme use of force, extrajudicial executions, disappearances, obstruction to medical care, denial of due process, as well as torture and sexual violence. And at least 328 people were killed, thousands were injured, as you know, and so many more were accused and sentenced of terrorism and coup plotting. And so many, and like 100,000 people had to flee. And all these crimes had led to the citizen demand for the resignation of Ortega and Murillo and solidarity with the victims. And one of the most cruel things that the government did was the denial of the victims, of the existence of the victims. And they created a narrative that dehumanized protesters, calling them terrorists paid by the CIA. And the lives of the victims became unrecognized, devalued, and therefore ungrievable. And there's a violent dispute over public spaces that prevents the construction of memory marks. For example, we did this type of interventions in the street and government forces would remove crosses and even throw oil on places that people have marked. And this violence spread beyond the death of the victims, stripping the families of the necessary rituals of mourning. Funerary rituals could not be carried out in peace because they were objects of terror and threats. In many cases, the families had to perform the wake behind closed doors because there was paramilitary groups outside. And in some cases, they even entered the place. And in burials, of course, people were afraid to, members of the community were afraid to go and be attacked. So this prevented all to have like the necessary networks to process their grief. Many families choose to bury their relative without an autopsy because they do not trust the Institute of Legal Medicine. So this means burying them and thinking that one day they will have to be exhumed in order to do the reliable investigations. So the process of grieving has remained pending, traversed by the absence of justice. And as Jennifer Goet and many Nicaraguan scholars have argued, the techniques of violence first practiced on indigenous and Black populations on the Caribbean coast has been expanded against mestizo rural populations, participating in labor and anti-extractivist social struggles like the one Gioconda mentioned, sorry. And during the 2018 uprising, what happened is that state violence extended to the urban centers. And most of the victims represented in the museum from the research we did were from marginal and precarious neighborhoods, as well from indigenous communities that were attacked the hardest because they had also had a known tradition of resistance during the Sandinista revolution. So one of the things I say is that Necro power in Nicaragua worked by governing by massacre and disposal of the victims' bodies, dehumanizing them through the circulation of images of death in the name of peace, tranquility, and circulation of goods. It also made as I mentioned, the victims ungrievable, as Judith Butler would say, and withhold the families the rights, giving them a civil death as an example of punishment of dissent. And in response to all this repression, the families of victims created an organization called Asociación Madres de Abril, which Kai mentioned, and also Mateo. And its acronym is AMA, which means love. And the main objective is fighting together for truth and justice. And I'm part of the memory commission of this organization. And of course, like all these events made me reorient my work and becoming an active member of this group. And we created this museum because one of the organization's central objective was the construction of memory because of how the government had created this narrative. And it was created with a human rights participatory approach in which the members of the association assume an essential role in the design, collection of information and presentation of the museum while we're still mourning. And it was created with the support of the Nicaraguan Academy of Science, the Nicaraguan Center of Human Rights, CENID, while they had also lost their offices and their the right to their offices and to do any type of denounces, and a multidisciplinary technical team that included sociologists, architects, human rights defenders, psychologists, and many others. And I'm gonna breeze through these, how we did the museum. So maybe I can tell you more about an update of what has happened with the victims' families now. But basically, we held open discussions to discuss the organic ways to remembering and documenting the facts for future investigations. And in one moment, we organized collective sessions in which we gather information about the events, and the families narrated how the victims were assassinated, where they were, the sites of resistance they participated, what was known about their murder, because not everybody knows exact details because there hasn't been any investigation, and the funerals. And we translated these maps into digital GIS maps to be able to create collective maps and find out patterns of repression and attacks. And we also held individual sessions that consist of interviews on photograph and collection of photographic archive and memory objects of each victim. And as you can see, this labor was embraced mostly by women. And we also decided to challenge the government's ban on public gatherings and created a temporary exhibition at the UCA, at the Central American University, UCA, in the Institute of History of Nicaragua and Central America. And this is the only place where people could gather in Nicaragua, actually. And there were always paramilitary people posted outside. So it had a lot of security issues, but we try to present the audience with the pain and absence that the victims have left in their homes through these photos of the families demanding justice and some objects that belong to the victims. This is like an example, and it had more than 10,000 visits and more than 25,000 visits online. And we had to rush the closing of the exhibition because there was an spike in repression in December 2018. 3 members of the museum team were arrested when they were trying to bring water and food to relatives of political prisoners at a hunger strike in the Church of San Miguel Arcángel. And at that time, AMA joined forces with their mothers and gave them a space to report their incarceration. AMA has always created a solidarity with the families of political prisoners, as well as many of the people that are currently in jail have been very supportive to the families in AMA. And today I wanna reiterate and demand the freedom for more than 180 political prisoners. And some of the situation faced by the victims in these 3 years is that all the activities organized have been harassed. In many cases, the families of victims have been robbed and assaulted. Whenever there's a date of an anniversary of their deaths, police post patrols outside the victim's house and impede their right to mobilize. And many families have been victims of even breaking in and entering of their homes, harassment, threats, defamation on social media. And with the pandemic even, many members of AMA have not used the health system because they are fearful that they would be misdiagnosed or mistreated. There are currently 2 members of AMA that are in prison. One is like a very, I guess, heartfelt situation because it's 2 members of a family. One is 21 years old and the other is 23 years old. And they have sentences for 10 years. They're the Oliver Montenegro and Dorling Montenegro. And 4 other members of their family have been killed. So it's terrible for that family. And Dad Parajon, he was detained 2 days ago on September 6th, trying to cross the border, fleeing possible repression. So just to wrap up, one of the things because you asked us like, what could maybe help us move forward? These are some of my ideas that could change the Nicaraguan situation. So we made an effort in documenting and naming the multiple forms of violence. And as I mentioned, the violence was not distributed equally among different bodies and classes. It was always the most marginalized and precarious bodies who have been in the front line receiving violence. And we try to resignify and accompany that violence collectively, a recognition that happened to us as a Nicaraguan society and not just individually, in order to collectivize and reproduce solidarity. And we articulate and dream of a future with justice without impunity, where the voices and demands of the victims are centered. Without the active participation of the families of the victims, there cannot be true process of solving the serious social, political, and human rights crisis in Nicaragua. And that the institutions, which is, I think, the most important thing of Nicaragua, have to be rebuilt. And the broken ties of the Nicaraguan society have to be repaired. So I dream of a society where the dignity of people is respected and there's a freedom of expression and thought, and the cycle of impunity ends. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emilia. And now, last but very much not least, we turn over to Carlos Fernando Chamorro.
Thank you, Kai, Steve, Francis. It's a great idea to organize this conversation among 2 generations of Nicaragua about our tragedy, our crisis, and our future. I'm going to talk about the challenges of the future, although I anticipate I don't have an answer to the question of this panel about how Nicaraguans can get rid of a totalitarian dictatorship. I'll go very few comments about how we got this bad. I think in the last 40 years, we wasted two great national opportunities to promote political change. The first one was the revolution of 1979 that released new forces of social transformation, although it was constrained by the political radicalization of the Sandinista front and a destructive, bloody war, which in fact was a civil war and a foreign aggression war. The national international alliance that produced the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship lasted shortly, and the revolution itself lasted a decade. The second opportunity was the democratic transition that started in 1990, ironically after the electoral defeat of the FSLN. The transition established a basis of a new national consensus regarding the preeminence of democratic institutions, the departidization of the army and the police, and the development of a market economy. Although the definition of a democratic state, accountability, and the balance between the state and the market was always blurred in favor of the economic elites. And during the next 16 years, we had three different governments and a succession of failures that allowed the resurgence of an authoritarian government. I could spend a long time talking about these failures. I am part of one of those failures to transform the FSLN into a democratic left political party. The FSLN became a political machinery controlled by a caudillo and a family. And yes, there is an important sector of the Nicaraguan society, at least 1/3 of the electorate, that still supports Ortega no matter what. And that's a very important question. Now, is that simply a legacy of the revolution, or is also related with the failures of the transition and the way in which Ortega consolidated his second government? Is a much more complex question. To advance my comments on what Mateo said, I think it's an important question, but it tends to be too academic if we don't see it through this continuous process of failures. That's the way I see it. And I also think that nothing has been inevitable. It wasn't inevitable, the failure has some explanations and some results. And it wasn't inevitable Ortega's come back to power. Yes, there is his own merit about the persistency in his strategy to capture the state from below and to preserve his political base. But there was also the pacto by Alemán, the division of the electorate, and an act of serendipity, the sudden and mysterious death of Herty Levites, the charismatic candidate of the democratic left. All these elements explain why Ortega came back to power. Yes, there was a failure of the democratic consolidation, but it wasn't inevitable that Ortega will go back to power and will have a dictatorship. And it wasn't even inevitable that Ortega's first period will consolidate into the second and third periods and to end up in this bloody dictatorship. I myself, from the very beginning Ortega came back to power, had the conviction that there was a process of concentration of power and consolidating a dictatorship, but there are also explanations about why he was successful. Well, there was also the incapacity of the political elites that were incapable during the transition to build democratic institutions, and they were incapable of defending the vote or defending democracy during the electoral frauds. And then there was the millionaire economic support that Ortega got from Chavez and his oil economy. But most importantly than anything else was the collaboration of the economic elites that Gioconda mentioned, that allowed the political legitimacy to the government at the expense of democracy and transparency, taking advantage of the economic and investment opportunities. This corporativist pact that lasted between 2009 and 2017 was a pillar of stability and governability for the strengthening of the Ortega dictatorship. It collapsed in 2018 during the massacres because of an ethical problem, And I believe whatever happens in this relationship between the economic elites and Ortega right now and in the near future will be a key element either for the consolidation of Ortega or for political change. When the April Rebellion exploded, led initially by university students in the absence of traditional political party, we celebrated it as a third opportunity of political change. It was perceived initially as a victory of the social capital of democratic civil society, which was part of the transition. It discarded the armed struggle as a means of political change. There was a hope of building a national alliance to promote democratic reforms. And it placed, as Emilia just talked right now, the demand of justice and the fight against impunity for the first time in the national agenda. But this movement lacked the strategic leadership, either to force Ortega to leave or to accept anticipated elections. In the moment the national protest was stronger, when everyone in Nicaragua thought it was a question of months to get rid of Ortega, the international political pressure was totally absent. That's a very important lesson for the future, simultaneity between national and international pressure. So Ortega imposed brutal repression in 2018. We know the story about the massacres, about the imposition of the police state. And in January this year, the pro-democracy Nicaraguan movement was involved in this internal process about selecting a single opposition presidential candidate and candidates for the National Assembly to compete with Ortega. But between May and July, the whole movement had been decapitated by repression. We know that there are 35 political and civic leaders in prison, including 7 aspiring presidential candidates that include my sister Cristiana, my brother Pedro, political, civic leaders from different generations, peasants, students, businessmen, human rights defenders, former Sandinista guerrillas, and many more are in exile. I think the opposition is paying a high cost of having invested all its resources into an electoral strategy abandoning civil resistance. It was never an easy choice, but this is a major lesson for the future about how to cope a dictatorship. The road to change requires civil resistance permanently, national unity or a national alliance, and international pressure simultaneously in order to put enough pressure to lead to political and electoral reforms. All these forces are absent in this moment. Ortega is going to impose a re-election November the 7th with no political competition, with a high level of abstention and a very questionable political legitimacy. And in the next weeks, the political prisoners will be sentenced guilty. Now, the Ortega government looks very strong, but it's weak. The fact that he eliminated political competition in the elections, the fact that in 3 years he has not been able to rebuild his alliance with the private sector are signals of weakness. But his repressive machinery, the economic and political control of the state, and the support of his supporters is intact. And there is no other power alternative in the country. I have the following questions. How the international community is going to deal with the question of legitimacy? My impression is that the international community is dispersed, mostly because of the crisis within the OAS between Almagro, Mexico, Argentina, and other countries. Beyond condemnations of violation of human rights, there is no tendency to put together the votes to condemn violation of the democratic charter, to fully isolate Ortega, and to shut down the sources of funds in the Inter-American Development Bank, in the Central American Integration Bank, in the IMF, and other international groups that are demanding transparency in the COVID crisis in Nicaragua. Now, how is the national community going to deal with the question of legitimacy? There is absence of leadership in the country, in the private, both in the private sector and both in the Catholic Church. So the most probable outcome is that we will see the business sector leaning towards accommodation under certain economic concessions, probably not recognizing Ortega victory or going back to bed like in an alliance, like in the previous pact, but without taking the risk of becoming a democratic actor. Now, another question is, how do you reconstruct the opposition from zero outside Nicaragua and in Nicaragua? It's a long process to rebuild a network of support with the grassroots movement and the repression. One can imagine that we will have at least two major campaigns, a campaign for the liberation of political prisoners and for the suspension of the police state and for the restoration of basic freedoms, and a campaign for to declare the illegitimacy of the electoral results and to call for new elections in 2022 or 2023. But if you don't have the political power to force a negotiation, you will not get this outcome unless there is a new political crisis. And there are no indications that this is possible in the short run. Nicaragua is going through the worst COVID crisis with thousands of deaths every day, while the government recognizes only one death per week. Thousands of Nicaraguans are fleeing the country every week, north and south. The economy is in recession, but it will not collapse. There will not be further private investment, but the economy can last 1 or more years, taking advantage of external funds and external demand because of the dynamic of the world economy. So although there are no prospects for a sustainable dictatorship in the long run, it can last longer if it doesn't face stronger national and international pressure. So the prospect for change depends at this moment mostly on the reaction of the international community, unless, yes, there are one and many other imponderable events that could take place, breaking the internal equilibrium. In one word, I see little prospect for change in the short run. And if there is any future opportunity to negotiate a political reform, I can only imagine that this will be without Ortega and Murillo. But again, that presupposes, again, a political crisis which is not taking place in Nicaragua right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and to all of our panelists. We're getting short on time, so I'll try to group a number of questions together from the audience, also in light of much of what you've all presented. So it seems that, at least from 2007 on, there have been some groups in society who have actively or passively accepted Ortega's consolidation of power and perhaps have a desire for a strongman ruler, a return to caudillismo. So what does this mean for the prospects of building democracy in Nicaragua? What are the effects of the current political crisis on the private sector and the military's loyalty, and whether or not they can be swayed away from the regime? And then one final question in this line related to the regime itself is, what might the succession plan be beyond Daniel Ortega, and how much would Daniel Ortega stepping down or passing away, having health issues, mean for the stability of the regime? So anyone of the panelists can jump in.
I'll just say a word about the army, because there's a lot of speculation about what's going on inside the regime, and we have not seen any clear signal about public or not non-public important discrepancies. There might be, but they're not on the surface. But I don't think the army will have any important role unless there is a crisis in which the army doesn't have a leading role. But that's what I'm trying to say about imponderable events or or a situation in which it provokes a political crisis that apparently it's not directly related with the economic recession in the country.
I think Carlos's comment about the military extends a little bit as well to the Sandinista front itself, where, you know, perhaps one might have expected after 2018 more defections of members of Ortega's inner circle. It hasn't quite happened. We don't know so much from the outside what the extent is of the divisions, of the fissures, but of course, from the very beginning of this project, the main challenge they have faced is the future in terms of who is going to succeed Daniel Ortega moving forward. And again, I think these questions of narrative of who represents Sandinismo, who doesn't, you know, become very central. As for the private sector, you know, I agree that it's unlikely that in the short or medium term, they're going to reinvent themselves as risk-taking democratic actors. And it's in part because they have a different reading of what happened over the past 10 years. The people in charge of the alliance with Ortega have recognized that it was a mistake, but not for the same reasons that we think it was a mistake. I think that they think that it was actually a pretty good arrangement, that they regret not paying attention to the institutional side. But ultimately, they think they were doing the right thing, putting economic growth first. Whereas I think the way civil society sees it is that this was a cursed agreement from the beginning. That was not something that was good, that went awry, but that this is 10 years of chickens coming home to roost, as it were.
Yeah, maybe for me, I just would add that the challenge for the opposition, as Gioconda said, it's like what kind of alternatives we can build and what kind of anti-authoritarian leadership can emerge. Because in each one of the organizations and movements, there's been so much struggle to organize, because we also carry that authoritarian, patriarchal, racist, violent system within us. So one of the things we've tried to do with the people I've organized is like, how do we put ourselves in the front line of the process of change within the organizations? And as I mentioned, accompany the violence and create like ways of caring for ourselves. But I think it's a challenge because, as you said, there's this impetus and need to have like strong men in power. Yeah, that it's kind of like what we've been seeing for so many years, especially like young people, because we've seen Daniel Ortega for like so many years as the ruling person, the president.
So I think that's on that note, one question that speaks to what you've been saying, Emilia, and to some of the possibilities for new focuses for social movements and opposition that Carlos mentioned, is how should organizing proceed after the November elections? Is it going to be possible to remobilize the population in general? Civil society networks have still been organized, but after the harsh repression of the summer of 2018, it's been extremely difficult to build a mass movement again. So what should the focus be domestically after November?
I think that's a very difficult question for everyone in a country where people are living in a state of terror, and all the organizers are leaving the country, either here in Costa Rica, in Mexico, in the US, in Central America, in other places, preserving their freedom and their lives. And I don't think Ortega has any plan about suspending the police state and the system of control impeding mobilization, people taken back to the street or protesting with basic democratic freedoms. That is a permanent element of the future. So at this moment, the only umbrella, I think, to reorganize civil society is human rights, is the political prisoners. And I think the church has an important role, but the church is also afraid. I think the business class should do much more than what they are willing to risk. But I find it very difficult. You cannot organize not even a protest within a church, because they will be surrounded immediately by the police, and that will not change. Now, there is always this question about recession, economic impoverishment, the impact of sanctions on some industries and the economy, but that doesn't translate into political mobilization. People are just trying to leave the country. So I personally don't really know what will happen.
Emilia and Mateo, did you have any thoughts on this?
It's so hard and depressing, to be honest. It's really hard to see. That's one of the things I've said before when they ask us, like, we're trying to see like a longer horizon with this, that is trying to aim for this change through the fight against impunity and to try to find justice either nationally or internationally. But the political crisis, it's really hard. They have been really good at instilling enough fear and instilling enough chaos that it's really hard to imagine possible avenues to get out of this crisis, to be honest. So I don't know if Mateo, Kai, or maybe members of the panels have ideas about this, but it's really hard, and hopefully there are some things that we can take into consideration that could, as Don Carlos said, that could change the balance of power. But for now, it's hard to think about that.
So now for our last set of questions, as we're running down on time, to shift from the very difficult domestic environment to the international community and the broader international environment. What should the role of the international community be right now regarding Nicaragua and efforts for restoring democracy, particularly for non-US actors? How important to the regime is the support of its remaining allies, such as Russia, Iran, and Cuba? And what are some of the broader implications right now at a time of democratic erosion and regression throughout Central America, in El Salvador, in Honduras for a number of years now? So how does Nicaragua fit into these broader international pictures, and what can and should international actors do?
Can I comment on the democratic backsliding? I think this is really important because, again, if you go back to the history of the Sandinista revolution, one of its most underrated aspects was the fact that from the overthrow of Somoza in 1979 to the transition in 1990, the lifespan of the Sandinista revolution overlapped very neatly with Latin America's third wave of democratization. This helped determine, right, the fact that the continent's governments were moving away from authoritarian military rule to civilian democratic rule elections. This helped determine the collapse of the Somoza regime. It shaped the Sandinistas' emphasis on liberal institutions as a tool for differentiating itself from Cuba. And of course, it determined the strange outcome in 1990 when the Sandinistas became the first socialist movement, which, having taken power through arms, handed over power peacefully. And so the transition in Nicaragua took place in a situation where there weren't objective conditions, economic crisis, foreign intervention, civil war, no history of elections, but it happened. And in part because Nicaraguan politics was caught in that wave. And so we know from the history of the 20th century that authoritarianism and democracy happen in these sorts of waves in Latin America. And so again, it makes you think, in some ways, Ortega, is unprecedented and extreme, but it really makes you wonder just how exceptional he is. Can you really understand Bukele, Juan Orlando, the Guatemalan mafia state without understanding Daniel Ortega? I don't think so.
I mentioned the crisis of the OAS, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is the information that I have, that as long as there is this connection between Mexico, Argentina, well, Bolivia obviously is an enemy, and others, but the Caribbean countries with Almagro, well, they can make a lot of statements about condemning human rights violations in Nicaragua, but they will not step further dealing with the issue of the illegitimacy of the electoral results in Nicaragua and the consequences that could have in the Inter-American Development Bank and other international financial institutions. That's a key question. And I don't think it is convenient for Nicaraguans that the US, the way Trump used to do it, will continue this unilateral policy dealing with Nicaragua. It's important what Biden said. Okay, we're going to have a foreign diplomacy, a multilateral diplomacy. Now, Ortega is suffering an a world condemnation, but it's a condemnation that is ineffective because it cannot go beyond the issue of human rights. And I think it will be important for Latin American countries to make their position and their statement in this crisis. Central America is a lot more complicated because Honduras, because of the weakness of and the crisis of Guatemala. Well, Costa Rica is some kind of isolated with Dominican Republic and Panama in this crisis, but will not take the leadership. Costa Rica, it is a question for other countries to step forward in this, let's say, political and diplomatic confrontation with Ortega. I don't think Ortega and Murillo cares anything at all about the sanctions, but their cúpula, I mean, their 300 most important generals, ministers, magistrados, etc. Yes, they are subject of pressure, not only because of individual sanctions, but the fact that understanding that there's no future, that if this government loses legitimacy, well, their time framework is reduced in a question of 1, 2, 3 years.
I think, just to add, I think there's a lot of ties that still can be created with movements in different places that are also fighting, demanding justice for like racialized state violence in the US and other places. It seemed like they're still in the progressive world bubble. There's still a lot of confusion about what happened in Nicaragua. A lot of people that had sympathy with Sandinismo has had a hard time recognizing the possibilities that a guerrilla movement turned into a dictatorship. And I think just that, because the people that opened the doors in the US for the Nicaraguan people were the most conservative ones. It wasn't the progressive ones. So I feel like there could be still ties that we can build with movements outside of Nicaragua, and even like from my side, I think about like all like feminists that are organized throughout Latin America, for example. Those are things that still can be done to kind of like help spread what happened and does not seem Nicaragua in like this Cold War vision. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Emilia, Carlos, Mateo, and Gioconda, who unfortunately had to leave early. This was really great and informative. And appropriately somewhat pessimistic, but I think very, very helpful for everyone in understanding the situation and what happens moving forward. So I will now turn it back over to Steve.
Thanks, Kai. Just picking up on that last point, I mean, I think Mateo made a really nice point, drawing the contrast in terms of the international environment to 1990. I mean, that was really the peak of sort of Western liberal capacity to impose, or at least successfully pressure for democratization. It was months, literally months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union was beginning to collapse. And for a brief period of time, as it turned out, for about a decade, the liberal West was really the only game in town. And the early 90s, a period where Jorge Serrano tries to close the Congress and international pressure beats him back in 1993. Balaguer tries to steal an election in 1994. He can't do it, largely because of international pressure. And I don't think we yet know quite what the limitations of the international community are, but it's a dramatic change. You're right, it's really depressing. On that depressing note, just 2 points. First of all, I want to thank Thaler and Gioconda Belli and Mateo Jarquin, Fernando Chamorro, and Emilia Yang for their terrific presentations. We really appreciate your time and your energy. And want to ask everyone to join us next week. We've got a terrific panel, a group of economists debating Latin America, the prospects for post-COVID economic recovery in Latin America, an immensely important issue. So thank you all very much and have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Fran.